Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody from Alaska. What I'd like to do now is I would like to speak to you about the current state of asset management practices that occur within drinking water systems, and spend a few minutes going through from the utility perspective what is important, what is emerging with respect to technologies and practices, and then speak to you about some lessons learned in the application of advanced asset management practices as applied within the water sector. So to begin this, I'd like to define what I mean by asset management. On the screen, you see basically a triangle, and there is an interplay and a relationship between three principal areas. One is the provision of levels of service that utilities provide to their customers. On the other leg is the cost of those services, and we heard quite a bit from Lisa about the importance of infrastructure investment and what consumers need to know, and that does cost money, and the cost causer must be the cost payer is a general principle applied at the utility level. Underlying all that is the concept of risk. And at the end of the day, water utilities are risk managers, and they balance many competing needs. The goal of infrastructure asset management applied at the utility level in drinking water systems is, one, is to be able to meet the required levels of service that customers, stakeholders, policymakers, and the general public expect and desire from their water utility, to be able to do that in the most cost-effective manner possible, to be able to provide those services cost-effectively with an acceptable level of risk, and by risk I mean risk of asset failure and inability to provide those required services. And they are done through the management of those assets, both physical, information or data, as well as the human assets used to provide the product and services, and to do that for today's as well as the future customers. Now, why is this so important? It's important for two major fundamental reasons. Strategic decisions are made by utilities on a regular basis, and those strategic decisions include long-range capital improvement programs. They include the annual or biannual, typically, budgets that are passed to operate and maintain those water systems in good working order, which all translate into fundamental budget decisions. Tactically speaking, there are also daily operations that occur, and employing good asset management practices really gets down to affecting what is done day to day at the utility level. The fundamental premise in today's modern drinking water utility is to establish firm goals and objectives that are the foundation, if you will, for how the utility will operate. Now, the utility uses both the human resources, its people, it employs various technologies, and it uses those technologies and the people in a variety of business processes to be able to make those daily operational decisions and to provide the strategy for the long run. This is a graph that is several years old, but it still remains true today, and which I wanted to present to you. The reason that employing advanced asset management practices are so important to water utilities is that they are so asset intensive. And what this graph represents is the relative amount of capital that must be invested by a water utility to generate a dollar of revenue to pay for the product and those services that it provides. And as the graph illustrates, water is the most asset intensive of the general utilities that are provided on a universal basis in our urban centers and throughout the United States. And typically, water is almost twice as expensive to provide to generate a dollar of revenue from a customer than almost any other utility. And when one thinks about this, naturally what falls out of this is the conclusion that water utilities are typically buried infrastructure. They are the deepest buried infrastructures in many cases, particularly in Anchorage, where we must bury our water mains at least 10 feet deep in order to provide freeze protection in a subarctic condition. But in general, water utilities are the most asset intensive of the general utilities. Now, from a utility management perspective, when utilities are employing asset management practices, they perform that with what I call the policy dance. And what I'd like to explain to you now is how the dance works. Lisa, in her prior presentation, discussed what do customers need and what the utilities need to know. Well, what utilities need to understand is what are the required levels of service from those customers, stakeholders, policymakers, and the like. Well, service levels directly impact and influence what is necessary for financial planning purposes to be able to provide those services in a very asset-intensive condition. The financial plans of utilities then must reflect the degree of risk tolerance that utilities have with respect to asset failures, and those asset failures then do influence how much risk the utility assumes in its business operations. Now, if one is out of balance in any one of these three areas, it will affect each of the other areas. So as a utility determines the level of tolerance for risk of failures, that drives what they must be thinking about in terms of the provision of services and the level of service that it will furnish in its service area. And then that, again, begins the cycle anew with affecting financial plans and then subsequently the degree of risk that the financial plans develop for a given utility. So this policy dance goes on continually within the utility sphere. Now, the application of modern asset management principles and practices, they vary in number and depth in implementation. There are several organizations around the United States where they have developed concepts and models around the modern utility providing good service employing advanced asset management principles. The American Water Works Association has identified 13 key concepts today that are employed by the water utilities. The Water Environment Research Foundation and the Water Research Foundation, borrowing on the SIMPLE concept, which was developed several years ago now by the foundations, they use a 10-step process. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency uses 5 questions that integrate the 10 steps of the SIMPLE process. And then finally, the Global Forum on Maintenance and Asset Management has identified 39 specific subject groups organized by 6 main topical areas, which they have termed the asset management landscape. And these 6 areas are illustrated on the slide that you see right now. What I'd like to do now, because it has a broad appeal in today's water sector environment, is to focus for a few minutes on EPA's asset management concepts. And at the highest levels, there are really 5 questions that today's utilities are trying to answer for themselves. The first is, what is the current state of my assets? And what that involves is the provision of an asset registry where assets have their condition assessed and develop an understanding of the failure modes that affect asset performance. And today's modern utilities are using many tools and techniques and innovative technologies to actually do condition assessment. And the research continues in a great way on all kinds of novel and innovative condition assessment techniques, both destructive and non-destructive testing. The intent is to determine the existing state of those assets so that one can assess what is the residual life remaining for those assets. And then subsequently, to use that data to be able to determine accurately life cycle and replacement costs in order to make good business decisions. The second general question then, once we have assessed the state of assets, is what is the required level of service, which requires setting target levels of service. And this goes back to a very important concept that Lisa spoke about just a few minutes ago. Utilities need to know what service levels and standards of service the customers desire and are also willing to pay for. So this is a very key component, and just as Lisa said, utilities are working very hard now through customer surveys and other analytical techniques to be able to understand what it is that the customers require. The third question then is, what assets are critical to sustain performance? And this is to determine what assets are most critical so that one can determine then from a criticality standpoint what happens when assets fail. The fourth question is, what are the best operational and maintenance and capital improvement investment strategies that will allow us to optimize our resources to provide those services specifically around assets? And then the fifth question is what is the best long-term funding strategy? Now, all of this requires data. All of this requires business processes to be in place, and this requires different tools and technologies that are emerging in the marketplace. A place to find information about that includes things such as the American Water Works Association resource community page, which is available on the web at the URL that's listed on the screen. And it's organized by the 13 asset management concepts that I spoke of a few minutes ago, around which there is a body of research and practical application that's available for utilities to tap into, as well as the general public. And I won't read all the essential concepts, but they go to many of the concepts that have already previously been introduced. Now, in practical application, I always tell utilities that I am engaged with that the advancement of asset management at the utility level is like building and maintaining a structure. And so I use this as the framework to provide the analogies. It involves first the development of risk policies, which are like the foundation of a structure. It sets the fundamental operating parameters, the goals and objectives, and defines basically the tolerance of a utility for failure and the required degree of mitigation to make sure that the risk profile remains with what the policymakers and stakeholders demand. It requires the setting of service standards, and when you think of it like building a structure, it's like specifying the quality of the materials that are to be provided. If you have a roof system, you may want to have a roof system that would be warranted to last more than 50 years' time. Or you could have an inexpensive roof system. You can specify the quality materials for the siding that will last and resist chalking from their painted surfaces. But the service standards are really setting the quality for what you want to have. Now, how do you source the information necessary to be able to perform asset management? It's like sourcing the materials in constructing a building. You do that through the generation of good business process within the utility and breaking down the silos that often exist in organizations. Now, to construct a structure, it requires several different skill sets, from carpentry to pouring concrete, to be able to provide electrical conduit and wiring, to be able to do plumbing and heating. All of that requires team collaboration. And as I mentioned to you a minute ago, breaking down the silos within an organization is a very important facet, and that team collaboration that's necessary to advance asset management practices is the same idea in developing a team of workers constructing a structure. The leadership buy-in is crucial because as an owner of a structure, you have to approve and you want to ensure that your vision is met at the end of the day. And that leadership buy-in from an asset management perspective requires what I call the 3 C's. And that is a clarity of vision. What do we want to achieve? It's a consensus to work towards that, and then it is a commitment to provide the resources, the time, and the effort when the going gets tough to be able to advance those practices. And then finally, like anything, there is always refinement and continuous improvement, and anyone who has been involved in building structures understands that when you go into building a structure, oftentimes during the process itself, one finds that there are ways to continuously improve, refine, and get a better outcome. So the lessons that have been learned so far by utilities in advancing these concepts are the importance of data management, which Lisa mentioned earlier, the importance to engage business processes at the beginning of efforts, which involves where plans are built, plans are developed, and then the designs are made for things. It begins at the beginning. It requires staff engagement and ownership. It involves setting business objectives at the beginning, not at the end of a process. It requires living processes to be developed, and then they must be sustained over time and continually refined. It's important to implement these things in a series of steps, and it continuously requires sustained investment in data processes and outreach. Lately, there's been an emergence of standards applicable to asset management and asset management systems at utility levels. It has begun back in the last decade or so through things such as the International Infrastructure Management Manual that has been published overseas. It has continued in recent past by the American Water Works Association, developing a series of standards. And as a standard-setting organization, AWWA has at least 2 that I'd like to point out here that go to business practices and risk and resilience management. And then lately, there's more recently has been the embracing of the International Standards Organization set of standards we refer to as the 55,000 series that deal with asset management in systems, requirements, and guidelines for application across things like the water sector. Now, I'd like to spend a few more minutes talking about the ISO standards because they have been adopted internationally and they are emerging as a tool to be used by utilities here in the United States. Beginning with what is the purpose, and the strategic asset management planning efforts described in ISO, they look to document the approach in implementing policy at an organization. They link the organization's strategy to policy. They clearly describe how they're applicable across the boundaries of an organization's asset management system. And it helps the organization set those fundamental objectives that I had previously mentioned in a prior slide that allows the foundation of good asset management application at a utility. And the final purpose is to make sure that decision-making at a utility is improved from the past. The strategic asset management planning does provide a foundational element for improved asset management. And these are the areas that utilities are now working on and improving. They are doing a better job at assessing risk. They're doing a better job engaging stakeholders, such as what Lisa described. They are helping establish within the framework of an organization roles and responsibilities for advancing those asset management practices, which include designing competency requirements for individuals working at the organizations. As we live in a world where we use data to provide information and intelligence to our operations, it's very important to do that. It's developing performance measurement systems so that we can ensure that we are meeting targets. It's creating operational maintenance strategies to manage assets on a life cycle basis. It's managing the data necessary to do that and making sure that we ensure continuous improvement over time. With respect to the strategic asset management planning, there are both explicit as well as implied requirements in these new standards that are being embraced, which include the asset management objectives and provide a basis for the scope of an asset management approach in a system. And then finally, drafting the strategic asset management plans in conformance with these standards requires these items: a statement of scope for an asset management system, the asset management policies themselves, documenting the approach to implementing these principles, documenting the relationship between the objectives and the entire organizational objectives and the organization's overall strategy, and then reflecting stakeholder needs and desired service levels. So to conclude, in today's modern utilities, improving asset management is really about managing risk better. It's developing a program which is much like building a structure itself. And in advancing these programs, utilities are finding important benefits. They're developing better business cases for their operational and capital spending, which is vitally important in today's world, specifically with respect to infrastructure and water infrastructure. Utilities are able to reprogram their capital program and find savings, and then understanding the trade-offs involved in spending with service levels. It's that policy dance that I mentioned earlier. Thirdly, it's improving and gaining credibility when facing policymakers and presenting utility needs. And with good policy, better risk management, it ultimately turns into real dollar savings in addressing things like the infrastructure funding gap, which we have all heard about with respect to water infrastructure. And then finally, there are tools, there are guidance and standards, there are many, many systems, there are many individuals that are working on tools both to help in condition assessment, to do long-term replacement planning, to develop integrated ways of managing the data that utilities own and use on a daily basis. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Thanks, Kurt. If you can just stay there for a minute. There's a question for you by one of the attendees. The question is that in the chart on the cost required to achieve $1 of revenue speak to the value of water and the fact that we are undercharging for it. So if you could address that before we move on to the next speaker.
Yes, certainly. Across the United States, there is a fundamental principle that utilities should charge their customers the full cost that it takes to provide the drinking water at the level of quality that is desired, the quantity that is necessary, and to provide that service to be able to have the cost causer be the cost payer and to pay the full cost pricing. Many utilities have struggled for many years to be able to get the political support to have the rates necessary to achieve that end. Today, about 97% plus or minus of the costs of maintaining the infrastructure and providing the services are borne at the local level through rates by water utilities. So it is very close but not perfectly achieved in today's world of providing those through rates the revenues necessary to provide the full cost of service. So the utilities continue to work on that, and it will forever be a challenge because oftentimes those rates are set in an environment where competing needs are always an issue to consumers and stakeholders. And what we find is that the goal remains, and we will, as a water sector, continually strive to meet that goal.